I call this story a fast car and a federal bailout. Not many can claim to have been bailed out of jail by a federal district judge, but I can. In 1981, I bought a Mazda RX-7. After much research, I decided that at $8,300, it was unquestionably the best sports car for the money on the market at the time. When it arrived, I realized it was a fine car, but I felt like I could get more out of it. I joined a newly formed RX-7 car club in Knoxville. At a rally, another guy mentioned an article about performance mods for the car. I went to the library, pre-internet, this is what we did, and found an article about a former McLaren racing team mechanic who moved from Britain and set up shop in Southern California where he built a Super RX-7. I gave him a call and he agreed to set up my car. I made arrangements to ship it to him. My only request was that it look stock to the uninformed eye. He said the only external modification he needed to make was adding an air dam under the front and agreed to use the Mazda stock dam used on the more expensive higher-end models. 6 months later, my $8,300 RX-7 base model returned a full-grown $25,000 plus beast. Transportation costs not included. He dynoed the car at 10,000 RPMs and a speed of 149 miles per hour. He said no doubt it would do over 160, but felt that to be on the safe side, it should be redlined at 10,000 RPM. I agreed as I had nowhere to test the top speed anyway. The car was a perfect sleeper. Not a sign of the modifications, and my favorite pastime became observing the faces of the Porsche, BMW, and other sports car drivers as I blew them away on I-40 West in Knoxville. Shortly after I got my car back from California, I transferred to TVA's Nashville office. I continued seeing a girl I'd been dating in Knoxville, making the trip across the Cumberland Plateau every couple of weeks. One weekend visit, I decided to return to Nashville shortly after midnight on Sunday evening so I could get a little sleep before going to work the following day. As I started up the mountain on I-40, the interstate was practically empty. I found myself enjoying drifting through the curves on the escarpment. I topped the mountain at Crab Orchard, cruised through Crossville, and headed on toward Nashville with no one else in sight. About 30 miles down the road from Crossville, I spied a large collection of red and blue lights on the interstate about a mile in front of me. As I approached the Monterey exit and assuming it was probably an accident and feeling a little sleepy, I decided to get off for some coffee. I pulled onto the off-ramp and noticed a couple of state patrol cars and a sheriff's car, all with lights blazing, blocking the bottom of the ramp. As I got closer, I realized the officers were pointing shotguns at me. I slammed on the brakes and came to a screeching halt a couple of 100 feet away from the roadblock. Confused, I started to jump out of the car and realized they were yelling at me to put my hands in the air and get face down on the pavement. As I started to comply, I heard a siren behind me and looked over my shoulder to see another patrol car, blue lights flashing, screaming down the ramp, coming to a stop just behind me. 2 state patrolmen jumped out, double-fisting their service handguns, shaking like mangrove trees in a hurricane. They ran up to me and rapidly put me in cuffs, all the while screaming incoherently. Finally, they pulled me to my feet, and the driver said, "Why didn't you stop? Why did you have to try to run away?" I said, "What? I don't know what you're talking about. I was just going to get a cup of coffee." He said, "Why didn't you stop for our lights?" I said, "I didn't see any lights. Where were you?" He said, "The Crossville pull-through." I asked if he was facing Knoxville, and he replied that he was. I said, "Well then, I'm sure I was already over the hill by the time you turned around and got your lights on. I'm sorry, I would have stopped if I saw your lights." He asked if I knew how fast I was going, and I said no, maybe 90 or 100. He huffed, "100, hell, we clocked you at 129 and rising as you went out of sight." Pointing to my car, he asked, "What the hell is that anyway?" He said he had been on the highway patrol for 14 years and no one had ever run away from him like that. I shrugged and said I was sorry again. The sheriff put me in the back of his car and took me to Monterey. The community didn't have a jail, so he dropped me off at the fire station and left me in the custody of the dispatcher. As he left, he said, I was lucky because the Justice of the Peace held court on Mondays at the fire station, and he handled traffic offenses in the county. However, since they were charging me with several offenses, including aggravated reckless driving, fleeing, failure to comply with a lawful order to pull over, and aggravated speeding, he might bind me over and send me to the county jail. That got my attention. Before the sheriff left, he told me I probably needed a lawyer and asked if I had one. I said no, but I knew a few in Nashville. He said if I wanted to try to get someone out of Nashville, he would ask the Justice of the Peace to delay my case to the afternoon session. I thanked him. I racked my brain trying to think of someone to call. Finally, it occurred to me to call a friend, Federal District Court Judge for Middle Tennessee, John T. Nixon. After I came to Nashville, I became friends with Joe McCarthy. He was the state director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons for the state of Tennessee. Joe and I often went to the Gersthaus, a German restaurant in North Nashville, for lunch. We usually ate at the bar, and quite often an older gentleman was already seated at the bar when we arrived. Joe introduced him to me as Federal Judge John Nixon. On occasion, the judge may have had a few too many to feel comfortable risking driving back to the federal courthouse. Joe worked in the same building and often drove the judge back and later took him to pick up his car. Over time, the duty fell to me on days when Joe wasn't around, and I didn't mind as I had to pass that way on my trip back to work. We hit it off because we shared a lot of interests. Jimmy Carter had appointed him to the bench, and I'd been the state youth campaign manager for Carter in his first campaign. The judge was a great storyteller and under the influence became quite eloquent. Regardless, I thought if anyone could help me, it would be him, if he was willing, and I'd never asked him for anything, and I figured maybe he owed me a favor. Morning finally came, and I reached Judge Nixon as he arrived at his chambers just before 9 a.m. The Monterey court was scheduled to go start at 9, so I rapidly told him what had happened and my predicament, asking if he could help me. He listened silently, then asked what I wanted him to do. He said he didn't see much that he could do. I said, I know it's presumptuous, but the sheriff said he could get my case delayed to the afternoon, and all I really want you to do is to talk to the local Justice of the Peace before my case is called. I felt it'd be a tremendous help. He again paused at great length, and then he said he was going to adjourn for lunch at 11:30, and that if I could get the local judge to call him in his chambers, he would speak to him on my behalf. I thanked him profusely. I went back and told the sheriff I had someone out of Nashville to represent me, and could he get the delay to the afternoon? Court was called to order. The sheriff went up to the JP and had a whispered conversation. Then he turned and waved me to the front. The JP asked my name, where I lived, and did I have a lawyer. I said I didn't have a lawyer. The sheriff shot me a daggered look. I said I had someone to speak on my behalf, though, if he was willing to give him a call at lunch. He said, that is somewhat irregular. Who? I replied, Federal Judge John T. Nixon in Nashville. I told the Justice of Peace I'd talked with Judge Nixon just before court, and he said that he'd be available to speak with him during lunch. I handed him the phone number and told him it was the judge's number in his chambers. His eyes widening, he gave a non-committal head nod and sent me to sit down. As the clerk read off the docket, the judge interjected, saying my case was delayed to the afternoon session. Just before 11:30 a.m., the court adjourned for the afternoon, and the JP headed into the fire chief's office and closed the door. The sheriff asked if I'd had anything to eat. I said not since the previous evening in Knoxville, and although I hadn't realized it, I was ravishing. He said to come with him and took me in his car to the local sandwich shop. This time I rode up front, and when we arrived, He bought me 4 of the best egg salad sandwiches I have ever eaten. When we returned, court was called back into session and I was called to the front. The JP again asked me my name and had the clerk swear me in. He asked the prosecutor for the charges against me. After the prosecutor finished reading, the JP said he reviewed the charges and record over lunch and decided to dismiss all charges except traveling at an excessive speed. He then said he was reducing the charge to simple speeding and fining me $25 for each 10 miles per hour over the speed limit, or $104 plus costs. I could either pay the fine immediately or spend 30 days in jail. How did I plead? I said guilty, and I'd pay the fine as soon as I could get to the bank across the street and back. When I returned, the judge said the 30 days had been reduced to the 12 hours I'd been in custody. I paid the fine and fees, repaid the sheriff's lunch, and got my car out of impoundment. The Justice of Peace never said a word about his conversation with Judge Nixon. I called the judge before leaving and left a message thanking him again for his help. Judge Nixon never brought it up, and neither did I. Thus ended my first and only federal bailout. Thank you.